In the vast expanse of the Galactic Council chambers, where 1,000 species had gathered to witness what many believed would be humanity's final hour, Ambassador Zarathek of the Veltar Empire stood trembling. Not from fear of the humans, those strange, pink-skinned creatures who had somehow carved out a small corner of space despite their laughably primitive technology, but from the weight of what she was about to propose. The Veltar Armada hung in space just beyond Earth's moon, 50,000 ships strong, each one capable of glassing a planet. The humans had maybe 300 vessels, cobbled together from scrap and stubbornness. It should have been a slaughter. But something was wrong. In the 3 days since the Veltar fleet had arrived, demanding Earth's surrender, not a single human ship had fired. They just waited. And, in that waiting, something had shifted in the cosmic balance that made even the draconic hegemony's war chiefs whisper nervous prayers to their ancestors. "I propose a marriage alliance," Zarathek announced, her voice cutting through the chamber's stunned silence. "I will wed their diplomatic representative to seal a peace treaty between our peoples." The chamber erupted. Marriage to a human? The idea was beyond scandalous, it was insane. Humans were barely classified as sentient by most galactic standards. They had no psychic abilities, no energy manipulation powers, no quantum consciousness. They were just meat and stubborn ideas. But, as Zarathek watched the human ambassador, a quiet man named David Chen who seemed more interested in sketching in a notebook than participating in intergalactic diplomacy, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the climate controls. Because she had read the classified reports. She knew what had happened to the three empires that had tried to conquer humanity before. She knew about the Krex Dominion's missing battle fleet. She knew about the Hive Collective's inexplicable retreat after achieving orbital superiority. She knew about the Trade Federation's sudden and complete economic collapse following their minor border skirmish with human merchants. And she knew something else that made her willing to sacrifice her own life to prevent this war. Humanity had never, not once in their brief but bloody history among the stars, actually tried to win a fight. Every conflict, every battle, every engagement had been them holding back, playing defense, offering mercy to enemies who had shown them none. And, somehow, that restraint had made them the most feared force in the galaxy. Now, as her own people's fleet prepared to discover what happened when you cornered humans with no choice left, Zarathek made her desperate gambit to save them all from learning why no empire, no matter how powerful, ever dared to fight humanity twice. The wedding ceremony was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. In the Great Crystal Cathedral of New Geneva, floating in Earth's orbital space, representatives from 12 major galactic powers watched as Ambassador Zarathek of the Veltar Empire bound herself in matrimony to David Chen, humanity's seemingly unremarkable diplomatic representative. Zarathek stood 7 feet tall, her crystalline blue skin catching the artificial starlight streaming through the cathedral's transparent walls. Her forearms moved in the traditional Veltar blessing patterns while her head tendrils swayed with nervous energy. Everything about her spoke of genetic perfection, of a species that had conquered death and transcended physical limitations millennia ago. Beside her, David Chen looked exactly like what he was, a middle-aged human in a slightly rumpled suit, carrying a worn leather briefcase and the kind of tired smile that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. His only concession to the grandeur of the occasion was a small bouquet of earth daisies pinned to his lapel. "Do you, Zarathek, daughter of the Crystal Throne, take this human as your bonded partner in the spirit of eternal peace between our peoples?" The officiant, a neutral mediator from the Galactic Council, spoke in the universal trade language, her words broadcast to 1 trillion watching beings across known space. "I do," Zarathek said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was committing to. She was giving up her claim to the Crystal Throne, her position in Veltar society, her very identity as she knew it. All to prevent a war that she was increasingly certain would destroy her people. The officiant turned to David. "Do you, David Chen, representative of humanity, accept this bond?" David's answer was quiet but clear. "I do." Then, he did something that made every alien diplomat in attendance tense. He smiled. Not the diplomatic smile they expected, but something warmer and more genuine. "And I promise to take very good care of her." The simple words sent ripples of confusion through the assembled crowd. Take care of her? She was a battle-hardened diplomat from one of the galaxy's most powerful empires. What could a human possibly offer someone like her? Admiral Korvac of the Veltar fleet, watching from his flagship's bridge, growled his displeasure. This was a mistake, he was certain. Humans were weak, primitive creatures who had somehow bluffed their way into galactic relevance. His fleet could end them in minutes. This marriage was just delaying the inevitable. Admiral, his tactical officer said, human vessels are moving into formation. Korvac's mandibles clicked in amusement. How many? 312, sir. Mixed classes, mostly converted civilian ships. Against our 50,000. Korvac studied the tactical display. They're not even powering weapons. No, sir. They appear to be escorting something. On the main viewer, a single human vessel approached the Veltar flagship. It was small, unmarked, and looked like it might fall apart if someone sneezed on it. A voice crackled over the communications array. This is Captain Sarah Martinez aboard the merchant vessel Lucky Strike. Requesting permission to come aboard for the traditional gift exchange. Korvac's secondary arms gestured dismissively. Tell them we don't accept gifts from prey species. But his communications officer looked confused. Sir, according to the marriage protocols we agreed to, the human delegation is entitled to present gifts to the bride's family. It's binding under the peace treaty. The admiral's eyes narrowed. He didn't like it, but they had signed the accords. Fine. One representative. Full security escort. Captain Martinez was exactly what Korvac expected a human to be: small, soft, completely unimpressive. She carried a simple wooden box and seemed fascinated by everything around her, asking questions about Veltar technology with the kind of innocent curiosity that made the Admiral's warriors uncomfortable. This is for the bride's family, she said, presenting the box. A traditional Earth gift. Korvac opened it dismissively, expecting some primitive trinket. Inside was a small, crystalline sphere that seemed to contain swirling galaxies. It was beautiful, but clearly just decorative glass. What is it? He asked. Martinez smiled the same warm smile David had shown. A memory sphere. It contains the complete historical records of every species humanity has ever encountered. Every culture, every story, every song. We thought you might like to know more about your new relatives. One of Korvac's science officers leaned forward, scanner in hand. After a moment, his face went pale. Admiral, this isn't glass. It's crystallized quantum information. The storage density, it's impossible. This sphere contains more data than our entire Imperial archives. That's not possible, Korvac snarled. Humans don't have that kind of technology. Martinez tilted her head thoughtfully. Oh, we don't. We traded for it with the Andromedans about 50 years ago. Nice people. They were having trouble with some pirates in the Magellan Clouds, so we helped them out. In exchange, they taught us how to make memory crystals. Every Veltar in the room went deadly still. The Andromedans were a myth, a legend whispered about by the oldest species in the galaxy. They supposedly existed in the space between galaxies, possessing technology that made gods look like children playing with rocks. The Andromedans don't talk to anyone, Korvac's science officer whispered. They've been silent for millions of years. Well, they talk to us, Martinez said casually. David's actually having dinner with their ambassador next week. Something about jointly developing new translation protocols for first contact situations. Korvac felt something cold settle in his stomach. If humans had casual dinner relationships with beings that existed in galactic legend. But that's not the real gift, Martinez continued. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a simple paper envelope. This is. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of handwritten paper. Korvac read it twice before the words made sense. It was a receipt for the purchase of the mineral rights to the Veltar Empire's 3 primary mining worlds. This is impossible, Korvac breathed. These worlds aren't for sale. They're the foundation of our economy. Martinez nodded sympathetically. Oh, we know. That's why we bought them from the Zephyrian Trade Collective 3 days ago. Apparently, the Veltar Empire defaulted on some loans about 40 years ago. The compound interest really added up. The Admiral's world tilted. The Zephyrians were galactic bankers, neutral in all conflicts. If they said the Veltar owed money. But, don't worry, Martinez added quickly. As a wedding gift to the happy couple, humanity is prepared to forgive the debt entirely. We'll transfer the mineral rights back to the Veltar Empire free and clear. The bridge was silent except for the humming of life support systems. Korvac stared at the human woman, the small, soft creature who had just casually revealed that humanity had purchased the economic foundation of his empire as a wedding present. Why, he finally asked. Martinez's expression grew serious for the first time. Because David asked us to make sure his new wife's people would be taken care of. He's very protective of family. Back on the Crystal Cathedral, the wedding ceremony was concluding. As tradition demanded, David and Zarathek exchanged vows in their native languages. When Zarathek spoke in the musical tones of ancient Veltar, the translation came through as formal diplomatic language about unity and peace. But, when David spoke his vows in English, something was different. The universal translators struggled with his words, producing fragments that didn't quite make sense in any alien language. Promise to stand between you and the dark. And, until the stars burn cold. And, they'll have to go through me first. Zarathek's head tendrils went rigid with shock. She understood English. She had studied human languages extensively in preparation for this diplomatic mission. What David had just promised wasn't a marriage vow. It was a declaration of war against anyone who might threaten her. The ceremony ended with the traditional sharing of light, where both partners contributed energy to a ceremonial flame that would burn for the duration of their bond. Zarathek channeled her psychic energy into a brilliant blue radiance that filled the cathedral. David simply reached into his jacket and pulled out a small electronic device. He pressed a button. Every light in the cathedral went out. Then, slowly, a new kind of illumination began to fill the space, not light exactly, but something that made seeing possible. It came from David himself, from his skin, his eyes, his breath. He was somehow generating visible electromagnetic radiation through pure biological processes. The alien delegates whispered in amazement and fear. Bioluminescence was known among several species, but this was different. This was controlled, directed, impossibly intense. David was producing more raw energy than a fusion reactor, and he was doing it as casually as breathing. How? Zarathek whispered, her scientific mind reeling. David's glowing eyes met hers, and his smile was warm despite the terrifying display of power. Trade secret. The Andromedans taught us a few tricks about energy manipulation. Turns out, once you understand quantum consciousness, biology becomes very flexible. The wedding feast that followed was a masterpiece of diplomatic cuisine, with dishes from a dozen worlds arranged in careful harmony. But Zarathek barely tasted any of it. She was too busy watching her new husband interact with the other delegates. With the crystalline hegemony's representative, David discussed recent advances in silicon-based consciousness research that supposedly didn't exist yet. With the Hive Queen's drone, he chatted about collective intelligence theory in a way that suggested intimate familiarity with hive mind psychology. With the Machine Commonwealth's ambassador, he debated the ethical implications of artificial sentience with the casual expertise of someone who had created and destroyed multiple AI civilizations. Each conversation revealed another impossible depth to human knowledge. They weren't just familiar with advanced science, they understood it better than the species that had invented it. But, it was David's conversation with the Draconic Hegemony's warchief that made Zarathek's blood run cold. Your people are natural warriors, David said, offering the massive reptilian alien a glass of earth wine. We've always admired the draconic martial traditions. Warchief Thakanar, who stood 12 feet tall and could breathe plasma, looked down at the human with barely concealed contempt. Admired? What would soft meat creatures know of war? David's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Suddenly, the small human seemed larger, more dangerous. We know enough. We've been practicing for about 300,000 years. Practicing? Thakanar's laugh was like grinding stone. You've had space travel for less than 2 centuries. What wars could you have fought? Oh, not space wars, David said quietly. Each other. The simplicity of the statement hung in the air like a blade. Thakanar's reptilian features shifted as he processed the implication. You fought your own species? David nodded. For most of our history, actually. Wars over territory, resources, ideology, religion, access to trade routes, succession disputes, colonial independence, ethnic differences, economic systems, and, sometimes just because we were bored on Tuesday. Thakanar's protective scales began to rise involuntarily. For 300,000 years? Give or take. We got really good at it. The last big one involved about 70 million casualties, and that was before we figured out nuclear weapons. After that, we decided maybe we should try fighting other people for a while. The war chief's voice came out as a whisper. How many humans died in your wars? David's eyes went distant for a moment, as if he was doing calculations. Total? Probably around 1.5 billion. Maybe 2 billion. It's hard to get exact numbers for some of the earlier conflicts. Every alien within hearing distance went silent. 2 billion casualties from internal warfare was beyond comprehension. Most species never experienced more than a few thousand combat deaths in their entire recorded history. And, now? Thakanar asked. David's warm smile returned. Now we apply that experience to protecting our friends. As the evening progressed, Zarathek began to understand what she had gotten herself into. Every human at the reception, the small diplomatic staff, the ship crews, even the catering personnel, displayed the same impossible combination of advanced knowledge and casual competence. They discussed quantum physics while arranging flowers, debated xenobiology while serving drinks, and solved complex mathematical proofs while tuning musical instruments. But it was the way they looked at each other that truly frightened her. There was a communication happening beneath the surface, a shared understanding that went beyond words or even telepathy. These humans weren't just working together, they were operating as a collective intelligence while maintaining individual personalities. When the reception finally ended and the alien delegates returned to their ships, Zarathek found herself alone with David in the private quarters that had been prepared for them. The space was simple but elegant, decorated with artifacts from both their cultures. You don't have to stay, she said quietly. This marriage was political. I don't expect. David interrupted her gently. Zara, I meant what I said in my vows. In human culture, marriage isn't just a political arrangement. When we make that commitment, we mean it. She studied his face, trying to understand this impossible creature she had bound herself to. Your people, they're not what we thought, are they? David's expression grew thoughtful. No, probably not. We've found that most species have some very strange ideas about humanity. We try not to correct them unless we have to. The reports I read, about the Krex Dominion, the Hive Collective, the Trade Federation, what really happened to them? David was quiet for a long moment, then walked to the window that looked out at the stars. The Krex tried to enslave us. We convinced them that slavery was economically inefficient and helped them transition to a post-scarcity economy. They're much happier now. And the Hive Collective? They thought individual consciousness was a disease and tried to cure us. We showed them how collective intelligence and individual thought could coexist. Now they're some of our closest allies. The Trade Federation? David's smile became rueful. They tried to monopolize intergalactic commerce. We introduced them to the concept of open-source economics and free information exchange. Their old system collapsed, but their standard of living improved by about 300%. Zarathek felt a chill run down her spine. You didn't destroy them. You improved them? We try to help when we can, David said simply. It's usually more effective than fighting. But, my people, the Veltar fleet, they came here to conquer Earth. David turned from the window and looked at her with those impossibly warm eyes. I know. That's why I married you. Now they're family. And humans protect family. Outside the Crystal Cathedral, Admiral Korvac stared at his tactical displays in growing horror. The human ships hadn't moved from their defensive positions, but something was happening to his fleet. Ship after ship was reporting the same impossible phenomenon: their weapons systems were being upgraded. Not sabotaged. Not disabled. Upgraded. Somehow, without his crews even noticing, human engineers had boarded his vessels and improved their technology. Energy weapons were firing more efficiently. Defensive systems were operating at 200% capacity. Navigation computers were calculating jump coordinates with unprecedented accuracy. And every single improvement made his ships less capable of causing harm. The weapons upgrades made them non-lethal but more effective at disabling enemy vessels. The defensive improvements prioritized protecting civilian populations over military targets. The navigation enhancements made it virtually impossible to plot courses that might endanger inhabited worlds. Sir, his communications officer reported, we're receiving a message from the human vessel Lucky Strike. Captain Martinez's voice filled the bridge again. Admiral Korvac, I hope you don't mind the small improvements we made to your fleet. Consider it another wedding gift. Oh, and if you're wondering how we did it, well, let's just say that when your species was still figuring out fire, we were already building starships. We've had a lot of time to learn things. Korvac's hands shook as he stared at the tactical display. 50,000 ships, each one now operating with technology that was generations beyond anything the Veltar had ever developed. And the humans had installed it all in a matter of hours, without triggering a single alarm. What do you want from us? He whispered. Martinez's reply was warm with genuine affection. Just to take care of your daughter. David's very fond of his new wife. As the first day of the marriage concluded, Zarathek lay awake in the quiet darkness, listening to her husband's steady breathing beside her. Outside, she could see the lights of human ships moving through space in patterns too complex for her enhanced intellect to follow. She had married a human to prevent a war, believing she was sacrificing herself to save her people from a feudal conflict against a primitive species. Instead, she was beginning to realize she had married into something vast and ancient and impossibly powerful that had been pretending to be young and primitive for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. And, tomorrow, she would begin learning why no empire in the galaxy ever dared to fight humanity twice. 3 weeks into her marriage, Zarathek discovered that her husband was not who she thought he was. In fact, she was beginning to suspect that David Chen might not even be his real name. The revelation came during what should have been a simple diplomatic dinner aboard the neutral space station Harmony Point. Representatives from the major galactic powers had gathered to discuss trade agreements and territorial disputes, routine political theater that usually bored Zarathek to tears. But tonight was different. Tonight, she watched David navigate the complex web of galactic politics with an ease that suggested intimate familiarity with every species present, every historical grudge, every hidden alliance. He spoke to the Andromedian ambassador in mathematical concepts that made the ancient beings' crystalline form shimmer with what might have been laughter. He discussed stellar cartography with the Voidwalkers in terms that suggested he had personally mapped their impossible dimensional territories. Most disturbing of all, he spoke to the Eternal Archives Keeper, a being so old that its memories stretched back to the birth of the galaxy, like they were old friends catching up after a brief absence. How long have you known my husband? Zarathek asked the Archive Keeper during a quiet moment. The ancient entity's response came through quantum harmonics that bypassed language entirely, speaking directly to her consciousness. Known? An inadequate term. We have existed in parallel awareness for approximately 12,000 of your years. Zarathek's world tilted. That's impossible. Humans only achieved spaceflight 2 centuries ago. The Archive Keeper's attention turned to her fully, and she felt the weight of eons in its regard. Child of crystal and starlight, your species measures time by the movement of matter through space. Some forms of existence transcend such limitations. Before she could ask what that meant, David returned from his conversation with the Voidwalkers, carrying 2 glasses of something that sparkled like liquid starlight. "Everything all right?" he asked, handing her the drink. Zarathek studied her husband's face, the same kind eyes, the same slight smile, the same unremarkable human features she had grown familiar with. But now she was seeing something else underneath, a depth that seemed to stretch beyond the physical boundaries of his form. "David," she said carefully, "how old are you?" The question hung in the air between them. Around the reception area, conversations continued in a dozen alien languages, but Zarathek felt as if she and David existed in a bubble of sudden silence. "That's a complicated question," David said finally. "How old do you want me to be?" The evasion was gentle but complete. Zarathek felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's environmental controls. "I want the truth," she said. David's expression grew thoughtful. He led her to an observation deck where they could see the swirling nebula that surrounded Harmony Point, its colors shifting in patterns that had inspired art and poetry from 1,000 worlds. "The truth," he said, "is that humanity is very, very old." He gestured to the nebula. "We were here when that was a cluster of newborn stars. We watched those stars live and die and become the cosmic dust that now dances in their gravity wells. We were here when the first of your people learned to shape crystal into tools. We were here when the draconic hegemony was just a collection of territorial lizards fighting over cave systems." Zarathek's enhanced mind reeled as she tried to process the implications. "But Earth's archaeological record, your technology level, your civilization. All very recent," David agreed. "About 50,000 years ago, we decided to try something new. We called it the human experiment." "Experiment?" David leaned against the observation deck's railing, his eyes distant with memory. "We wanted to see what would happen if we started over. Forgot most of what we knew, abandoned our advanced technology, and tried to rediscover civilization from the ground up. It was educational." Zarathek stared at him in growing horror and fascination. "You voluntarily regressed to a primitive state?" "Not regressed. Reset. We kept some observers, some keepers of knowledge, but the vast majority of us chose to experience what it was like to be young again. To struggle, to discover, to make mistakes and learn from them." "Why?" David's smile was rueful. "Because we were bored. And because we were becoming something we didn't like. When you've existed for millions of years, when you've solved every problem and conquered every challenge, you start to stagnate. We were turning into the kind of beings who viewed younger species as pets or playthings. We didn't want that." The pieces were beginning to click together in Zarathek's mind. The wars. The constant fighting throughout human history. That wasn't natural. Oh, it was natural. That's what made it so valuable. When you choose to forget your divine nature and experience genuine mortality, you rediscover things like passion, creativity, desperation, and, yes, violence. We learn more about ourselves in 50,000 years of struggling on one small planet than we had in the previous million years of effortless existence." Zarathek felt sick. "But the casualties. 2 billion dead in your wars." David's expression grew pained. "Every single one volunteered. Before the reset, when we still remembered who we were, everyone chose whether to participate in the experiment. Those who died knew they would experience genuine death, no resurrection, no backup consciousness, no safety net. They chose to experience mortality completely. And the others? The ones who survived? We all participated, in one form or another. Some as active players, some as observers, some as guardians making sure the experiment didn't destroy everything. But we all chose to forget our true nature and experience humanity as it developed." Zarathek was quiet for a long time, watching the nebulas dance. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "When did you remember?" "The remembering has been gradual. First contact with galactic civilization started triggering memory recovery. Each species we encountered, each challenge we faced, brought back more of what we once were. The process accelerated after we met the Andromedans. They never forgot us, you see." They've been waiting for us to remember ourselves. And, now? David turned to look at her directly, and, for just a moment, Zarathek saw something vast and ancient looking back at her through his human eyes. Now we're caught between what we were and what we chose to become. The experiment isn't over, but we're starting to remember why we're capable of things that surprise other species. The implications crashed over her like a tidal wave. The Krex Dominion, the Hive Collective, the Trade Federation, you didn't just defeat them. You educated them. We helped them evolve past the point where they needed to be our enemies. It's much easier when you've had a few million years to develop patience and perspective. Zarathek gripped the railing as another realization hit her. My people. The Veltar fleet. You could have destroyed them in seconds. Of course. But why would we? Admiral Korvac and his crews are good people caught up in a political situation that wasn't their fault. They deserved better than to be vaporized for following orders. So instead you upgraded their ships? David's grin was thoroughly human despite everything else. We gave them technology that will keep them safe and make them better at their jobs while making it impossible for them to commit atrocities. In about 6 months, Admiral Korvac is going to realize that his failed conquest of Earth has somehow resulted in the most advanced fleet in Veltar history. He'll be promoted to Grand Admiral and spend the rest of his career wondering why humans make such terrifyingly effective allies. The scope of humanity's manipulation was breathtaking. You've been steering galactic civilization. Gently. Carefully. We learned patience during the experiment. Force creates resistance, but the right nudge at the right moment can guide an entire civilization towards something better. A new thought occurred to her, more terrifying than all the rest. David, what am I to you? Am I just another experiment? David turned to face her fully, and his expression was entirely human, vulnerable, uncertain, hopeful. You're my wife. Nothing about that is an experiment. But you chose me for political reasons. To prevent a war. I chose you because I fell in love with you the moment you stood up in the Galactic Council and proposed marriage to save your people. I chose you because in that moment, you displayed the kind of courage and selflessness that humanity spent 50,000 years learning to value. I chose you because you reminded me why the human experiment was worth it in the first place. Zarathek searched his face for deception and found none. But I'm not human. I'm not part of your ancient species. I'm just. You're yourself. Beautiful, brilliant, brave. Species isn't what makes someone worth loving. Before she could respond, an alarm began echoing through the station. Emergency lights bathed the observation deck in crimson as the station's AI announced, all delegates to emergency positions. Unidentified vessels approaching at combat speed. Through the observation windows, they could see ships emerging from hyperspace, sleek, dark vessels that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Zarathek recognized them immediately. Shadow Fleet, she breathed. But they're supposed to be extinct. The Shadow Fleet was a legend, a nightmare from the early days of galactic civilization. Beings from outside the galaxy who had tried to conquer and consume entire star systems before mysteriously disappearing millions of years ago. If they were returning now. How many ships? David asked, his voice calm despite the chaos erupting around them. Zarathek checked her personal scanner. Sensors show that's impossible. Thousands. Maybe tens of thousands. Well, David said, straightening his tie with casual precision, I suppose it's time for humanity to stop pretending to be harmless. He touched a small device on his wrist, and, suddenly, the air around them shimmered. When the distortion cleared, they were no longer alone on the observation deck. A dozen humans had materialized from nowhere, not transported, not teleported, simply stepping into existence as if they had always been there. But these weren't the same kind of humans Zarathek had grown accustomed to. These beings radiated power like miniature stars. Their eyes held the depth of cosmic time, and, when they moved, space itself seemed to bend around them. Status report, David said, his voice carrying an authority that made the station's hull vibrate in harmony. One of the newcomers, a woman who looked no older than 30 but whose eyes held the weight of eons, responded without consulting any instruments. Shadow Fleet Advance Force. Approximately 40,000 vessels. They're probing our defenses and broadcasting a consumption ultimatum to all inhabited systems. Time frame? 6 hours until they begin systematic harvesting of intelligent life. David nodded as if this was merely an inconvenient scheduling conflict. Options? Another figure, a man whose presence made Zarathek's quantum-enhanced senses scream warnings about spatial distortion, spoke up. We could convince them to leave. The usual methods: economic manipulation, technological superiority demonstration, philosophical conversion. Time requirements? Several months, assuming optimal cooperation. David shook his head. Too long. Civilian populations are at risk. A third voice, belonging to someone whose form seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously: we could reveal our true nature and simply ask them to stop. And spend the next 1,000 years explaining to the galactic community why ancient humanity has been pretending to be a young species? David's expression was grim. The social upheaval alone would destabilize civilization for generations. So what do we do? Zarathek found herself asking. All eyes turned to her, and she realized she had spoken without permission to beings whose power levels were incomprehensible. But David's smile was warm and reassuring. We handle this the human way, he said. We protect our family. He turned to his companions. Full deployment. I want the Shadow Fleet convinced that attacking this galaxy was the worst mistake they've ever made, and I want it done without revealing our nature to the galactic community. The usual limitations, the woman asked. No permanent harm to their crews. No technology they can't reverse engineer eventually. No alterations to their basic psychology. But make it clear that consumption of intelligent life is no longer an option in this galaxy. As the other humans began to fade back into whatever dimensional space they inhabited, David turned to Zarathek. I need you to stay here and coordinate with the Galactic Defense Forces. Keep them calm, keep them organized, and don't let them do anything heroically stupid. Where are you going? David's expression was gentle but implacable. To have a conversation with some very confused interdimensional predators. Before she could object, he kissed her forehead softly. I love you, he said. And I promise this will all make sense eventually. Then, he was gone, not disappeared but simply no longer present in the same way that silence follows the end of music. Alone on the observation deck, Zarathek watched as something impossible began to happen in the space around Harmony Point. The human ships, those few hundred vessels that had seemed so pathetically outgunned, began to change. Not physically. Their hulls remained the same battered metal and improvised armor. But the space around them began to warp and bend, creating patterns of distortion that hurt to look at directly. Energy readings spiked beyond her scanner's ability to measure, and then settled into configurations that defied every law of physics she had ever learned. The Shadow Fleet's advanced scouts, moving at speeds that should have been impossible, suddenly found themselves moving through space that was no longer cooperating with their intentions. Ships that had been approaching at attack velocity were now somehow traveling away from their targets despite their engines continuing to fire forward thrust. And, in the center of the spatial distortions, David Chen, unremarkable human diplomat, stood in open space without protection, speaking to the Shadow Fleet's command vessels in a voice that carried across the vacuum as clearly as if he were standing next to them. Zarathek couldn't hear the words, but she could see the effects. One by one, the dark ships began to power down their weapons. Then, their engines. Then, their entire offensive systems. Whatever David was saying to them, it was working. It was also, Zarathek realized with growing amazement and terror, being broadcast live to every ship in the galactic fleet. Her own people, the Veltar warriors who had come here to conquer Earth, were watching a single human convince an interdimensional army to abandon their invasion through what appeared to be polite conversation. The marriage she had entered to prevent one war was about to end a conflict that could have consumed the entire galaxy. And her husband was conducting this miracle while standing in hard vacuum, talking to cosmic horrors as if they were neighbors who had gotten a bit too enthusiastic about their gardening. The conversation between David Chen and the Shadow Fleet lasted exactly 17 minutes. When it ended, 40,000 interdimensional warships simply left. Not in defeat. Not in retreat. They departed with what could only be described as apologetic haste, broadcasting messages of gratitude and promises to reconsider their approach to resource acquisition before vanishing back into whatever dark space they had emerged from. Zarathek watched from the observation deck of Harmony Point as the impossible became routine. Her husband, who moments before had been standing in hard vacuum conducting diplomatic negotiations with cosmic predators, now materialized beside her as casually as stepping through a doorway. "How?" she whispered. David straightened his jacket and checked his watch as if he had just returned from a particularly mundane business meeting. "I explained the situation to them. They're not evil, just limited in their perspective. They've been operating under the assumption that intelligence is rare and, therefore, acceptable to consume for sustenance. Once they learned how common sentient life actually is, and how many species have developed beyond the need for aggressive resource extraction, they agreed to explore alternative approaches." "You convinced an army of interdimensional locusts to become vegetarians?" "More or less. They're actually quite reasonable once you get past the whole we devour civilization's first impression." Around them, the emergency alarms had fallen silent. Through the station's communication systems, they could hear the confused but relieved chatter of Galactic Defense Forces trying to understand what had just happened. "Veltar command to all ships, the Shadow Fleet has withdrawn. Repeat, threat has been neutralized. Draconic hegemony forces reporting all clear. Unknown how conflict was resolved. Machine Commonwealth vessels requesting explanation for observed spacetime distortions around human ships." Admiral Korvek's voice cut through the chatter. "Human vessels, please explain your tactical capabilities for our after-action reports." David touched his communication device. "Admiral Korvek, this is David Chen. I'm afraid the details are classified, but I can tell you that the Shadow Fleet realized they were operating under some misconceptions about galactic civilization. We helped clarify a few points." The silence that followed was filled with the kind of respectful terror that Zarathek was beginning to recognize as the standard response to human diplomatic intervention. Finally, Admiral Korvek's voice returned, carefully controlled. "Mr. Chen, with respect, our sensors recorded spatial distortions that suggest technology levels beyond our current understanding of physics." "That's not inaccurate," David replied pleasantly. "But don't worry about it. The situation is resolved, no one was harmed, and normal spacetime should resume behaving predictably within the hour." "Normal spacetime," Zarathek repeated faintly. "You were manipulating spacetime. Just local adjustments. Nothing dramatic." Before she could process that statement, another presence materialized on the observation deck. It was the same woman who had appeared during the crisis briefing, but now her power was carefully contained, making her seem almost ordinarily human. "Status report, Commander Chen," she said with crisp military precision. "Commander?" Zarathek filed the detail away for later analysis. "Shadow Fleet has been redirected to productive activities," David reported. "They're interested in establishing trade relationships and learning more about post-scarcity economics. I suggested they start with the Andromedans. They appreciate philosophical discussions about the nature of existence." Galactic response? Confused but grateful. "No one's asking too many questions yet." The woman nodded. "Good. The Council's prepared a cover story about experimental human defensive technology. Nothing that will raise uncomfortable questions about our actual capabilities." "Council?" Zarathek asked. Both humans turned to look at her, and she realized she had again spoken without invitation. But David's expression remained warm and encouraging. "The Human High Council," he explained. "The governing body that oversees our species' interaction with galactic civilization. They've been managing our gradual reintegration since the memory recovery began." "How many of you are there? I mean, how many ancient humans?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. David exchanged a glance with his companion before answering. All of us, he said simply. The words hit Zarathak like a physical blow. All of you? Every human currently alive is a participant in the human experiment. Some remember more than others, some have recovered more of their original capabilities, but we're all part of the same ancient species that chose to experience mortality and rediscover what it means to be genuinely alive. The implications were staggering. Every human ship captain, every diplomat, every merchant trader. All ancient beings pretending to be young for the sake of philosophical exploration, the woman confirmed. Though pretending isn't quite accurate. We genuinely experienced mortality, growth, learning, death. The experiment was real. We simply chose to remember who we were once it was complete. Zarathak leaned against the observation deck railing, feeling dizzy despite her enhanced physiology. The economic manipulation of the Veltar mining rights, the technological upgrades to our fleet, the casual relationships with species that are supposed to be mythological. All expressions of our original nature, David said. We've had millions of years to develop patience, perspective, and the kind of technological mastery that makes most problems solvable through creative application of physics. But, why maintain the deception? Why not reveal what you are? The woman, who still hadn't introduced herself, answered that question. Because galactic civilization isn't ready for the truth. If the younger species learned that humanity predates most of their star systems, that we've been gently guiding galactic development for millennia, the psychological impact would be devastating. Social collapse on a galactic scale, David agreed. Species would either become dependent on us as parental figures or rebel against us as oppressive overlords. Neither outcome would be healthy for galactic civilization. So you pretend to be primitives. We are primitives, David corrected gently. That's the beauty of the human experiment. By choosing to forget our divine nature and rediscover it through genuine struggle, we became something new. We're not the same ancient beings we were before. We're those beings filtered through the experience of authentic mortality, growth, love, loss, and rediscovery. Zarathak was quiet for a long time, processing the magnitude of what she was learning. Finally, she looked up at her husband with a mixture of awe and frustration. Is there anything about you that's actually what it seems to be? David's smile was entirely human, warm, slightly uncertain, completely genuine. My love for you. That's exactly what it seems to be. The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. But, I'm so young compared to you. I'm barely a century old. And, I spent 50,000 years forgetting how to be ancient so I could remember how to be surprised by beauty, challenged by intelligence, and moved by courage. You've taught me more about being genuinely alive in 3 weeks of marriage than I learned in the previous millennium of existence. The woman cleared her throat diplomatically. Commander, the Council requests a full debrief on the Shadow Fleet intervention. David nodded. Of course. He turned to Zarathak. I need to handle some administrative details, but this should only take a few hours. Will you be all right? I think so. But, David, what happens now? What happens to us? David's expression grew thoughtful. That depends on what you want. You've learned something about humanity that fewer than a dozen non-humans in the galaxy know. You could choose to forget. We have the technology to selectively edit memories without causing any harm. You could return to your people and remember this as a successful diplomatic marriage that prevented a war. Or you could choose to remember and help us figure out how to guide galactic civilization toward a point where the truth about humanity won't cause a complete social collapse. The choice was overwhelming. Forget everything and return to a simpler existence, or become complicit in a deception of galactic proportions. How long do I have to decide? Take all the time you need. This isn't a decision that should be rushed. After David and the woman departed for their council meeting, Zarathak remained alone on the observation deck, watching the normal traffic of galactic commerce resume around Harmony Point. Merchant vessels, diplomatic transports, and patrol ships moved through space in patterns that seemed routine and predictable. But now she saw the subtle signs of human influence everywhere. Trade routes that encouraged peaceful interaction between traditionally hostile species. Defense formations that prioritized protecting civilian populations over strategic advantage. Communication protocols that fostered understanding rather than dominance. Humanity wasn't just participating in galactic civilization, they were quietly, patiently, lovingly nurturing it towards something better. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Admiral Korvac, who had apparently come to Harmony Point to personally thank the human diplomatic mission for their intervention. Zarathek watched through the observation windows as the massive Veltar commander spoke with Captain Martinez and other human representatives. What struck her wasn't the conversation itself, but the body language. Admiral Korvac, a warrior who had commanded respect through strength and intimidation for centuries, was speaking to the humans with the careful deference of a student addressing respected teachers. And the humans were responding with the kind of gentle patience that suggested they were accustomed to guiding the development of younger beings. It was, Zarathek realized, exactly the kind of interaction you might expect between wise parents and beloved children who were still learning how to navigate a complex universe. The thought sent a chill through her crystalline spine. How many other species had experienced this same gradual realization? How many other first contact scenarios had actually been humanity gently introducing themselves to civilizations they had been watching develop for millennia? Her personal communication device chimed with an incoming message. The sender was listed as Andromedian Cultural Exchange, but when she opened it, the content was pure mathematics, quantum equations that described consciousness patterns across dimensional boundaries. She was still puzzling over the equations when their meaning suddenly became clear. It wasn't a message about consciousness patterns. It was a demonstration of consciousness patterns. The Andromedian ambassador was showing her how to perceive the true nature of the beings around her. With her enhanced perception recalibrated by the mathematical framework, Zarathek looked out at the space around Harmony Point and nearly gasped aloud. Every human ship, every human crew member, every human diplomat blazed with contained energy signatures that dwarfed anything she had ever encountered. They weren't hiding their power, they were compressing it, folding it into dimensions that didn't interfere with normal spacetime, expressing just enough to accomplish their goals without terrifying everyone around them. It was like watching gods play at being mortals while trying not to accidentally break reality through casual use of their natural abilities. But, more than that, she could see the connections between them, quantum entanglement patterns that suggested every human was simultaneously an individual consciousness and part of a vast collective intelligence that spanned dimensions. They weren't just an ancient species pretending to be young. They were a transcendent civilization that had chosen to experience limitation and rediscovered infinite possibility through the journey. The implications were beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. When David returned from his council meeting, he found her still staring out at the human ships with her enhanced perception active. "You can see us now," he said simply. "The Andromedians taught me how to look properly." She turned to face him, seeing him clearly for the first time. The containment patterns around his consciousness were so elegant they qualified as art, holding power that could reshape galaxies while maintaining the appearance of an ordinary human diplomat. "You're magnificent." David's human expression grew embarrassed. "We're what we've always been. We just forgot for a while, then remembered in a new way. And you chose me. Out of all the beings in the galaxy, you chose to marry someone who's essentially an infant compared to your actual age. I chose you because you're brave enough to sacrifice everything to protect the people you love, intelligent enough to keep growing and changing, and beautiful enough to remind me why existence is worth celebrating." David stepped closer, and his presence felt warm and safe despite the cosmic forces contained within his human form. "Age is just time past. What matters is what you do with the time you have." Zarathek was quiet for a moment, then made her decision. "I want to remember," she said. "I want to help. And I want to understand why no empire ever fights humanity twice." David's smile lit up his human features with joy that felt genuinely mortal despite his ancient nature. "That last one's easy to explain. Fighting us once teaches species that conflict with humanity doesn't end with victory or defeat. It ends with improvement." "Improvement?" Every species that's ever tried to conquer us has ended up becoming a better version of themselves. The Krex discovered post-scarcity economics. The Hive learned individual expression within collective harmony. The Trade Federation found open-source cooperation. Your own people are about to experience a technological and cultural renaissance that will make them one of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. And they never connected to their conflict with humanity? They think they earned it through their own growth and development. Which is true, in a sense, we just provided the right circumstances and gentle encouragement. No one likes feeling manipulated, but everyone enjoys becoming their best possible self. Zarathek thought about Admiral Korvek, about the upgraded ships and the improved technology, about the way her people would inevitably interpret their failed conquest as the beginning of a new golden age. That's why no one fights you twice, she realized. Because the first fight transforms them into the kind of people who would never choose to fight you again. Exactly. David reached out and took her hand, his human fingers intertwining with her crystalline ones. We learned during our mortal experiment that the most powerful force in the universe isn't destruction or domination. It's the capacity to help others become who they're meant to be. As they stood together watching the stars through the observation windows, Zarathek felt the weight and wonder of the secret she now carried. She was married to a god who had chosen to experience mortality, part of a conspiracy of ancient beings dedicated to nurturing galactic civilization toward wisdom and peace. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of impossible love story that could only happen once in the lifetime of a galaxy. And, tomorrow, she would begin learning how to help write the next chapter of that story, one gentle nudge toward wisdom at a time.